The Mythology of All Races, Volume 2, Eddic. Chapter 10, Balder. The references to Balder in the Poetic Edda are comparatively few and occur in 6 of the poems. From these we learn the following facts about him. He is the son of Odin and Frigg. According to Grimnismal, his heavenly dwelling is Breidablik, wide shining, which he built for himself, a place free from all crimes. He was troubled by evil dreams. The gods took counsel over this, and Odin rode down to Hel to consult the dead seeress, raised up by his spells, and calling himself Vegtam, forced her to reply to his questions. She answered first that a place is prepared in Hel for Balder, and that hope is gone from the gods. Hod will be Balder's bane, bringing to Hel the hero whom he will deprive of life. But Balder will be avenged. Rind bears Vali in Vestrasalir, Western Hall, to Odin. When one night old, he will fight, and bring Balder's slayer to the pyre. What maidens are those who weep for this and toss to the sky the tops of the sails? Asked Odin. This enigmatic question revealed to the seeress who her questioner really was. Odin says that she is no Volva nor prophetess. Rather is she the mother of 3 giants, Thursar. She bids Odin ride home. None will see her again till Loki is free of his bonds and the doom of the gods arrives. This story is the subject of Balder's Draumar. Voluspa also refers to the death of Balder. The seeress says, I saw for Balder, Odin's son, the soft-hearted god, destiny set. Full grown on the fields, slender and fair, the mistletoe stood. From this tree was made, which seems so slender, a deadly shaft, which Hod shot. Then follow the lines from Balder's Draumar about Vali, and the seeress resumes. In Fensalir, Frigg weeps sore, for Valhall's woe. Would ye know not yet more? The short Voluspa in Yunlol Yod refers to Balder's death, and says that the gods were 11 in number when he bowed his head on the hill of death. Vali was swift to avenge this, slaying quickly his brother's slayer. Skirnismal speaks of the ring Draupnir as that which was laid on Balder's pyre. In Vafthrudnismal, Odin asks the giant what words Odin spoke in the ear of Balder on his pyre. In Lokasenna, Loki tells Frigg that he is the cause of Balder's death. In these notices we learned that Hod was Balder's slayer. Only in Lokasenna is it hinted that Loki was to blame for his death. The long prose narrative compiled by Snorri from these and other sources shows that Hod was the unwitting cause of the slaying, because of Loki's action. The original myth may thus have had no place for Loki, who was later introduced into the story. Finally, in Voluspa, Balder is said to come back to the renewed world after the doom of the gods, and with Hod he lives in Ropt's or Odin's battle hall. The Husdrapa of Wolf Ogason, 10th century, describes pictures painted on the wainscot and roof of a hall in Iceland. Among these were scenes from Balder's funeral. Frey rides his boar, Heimdall his horse, Odin follows, then the Valkyries and the ravens. Another scene depicted the giantess Jorukin launching the ship on which the pyre is set, while Odin's champions follow the wolf on which she rode. The 10th century skalds, Cormac and Vathrildi, also referred to the Balder myth. We now turn to Snorri's later prose narrative. Balder the Good is Odin's second son, and good things are to be said of him. He is the best god, praised by all. So beautiful and fair is he that light shines forth from him. A certain herb is so white that it is called Balder's eyelash, Balder's bra. This shows how fair his hair and body are. He is wisest of the Aesir, most fair of speech and gracious, yet none may gainsay his judgments. He dwells in Breidablik, where nothing impure can be found. Nanna, daughter of Nep, is his wife. Their son is Forseti. In several chapters, Snorri describes Balder's death and funeral. He dreamed evil dreams, and the Aesir resolved to ask safety for him from all kinds of dangers. Frigg took oaths from fire, water, metals, stones, trees, animals, etc., that none of these should hurt him. Now it became a sport of the gods to shoot or hew or beat Balder. Nothing could do him harm. When Loki saw this, he was displeased and went to Fensalir in woman's form to ask Frigg why this was done. Then he learned that she had taken oaths of all things save a tree sprout called mistletoe, growing to the west of Valhall, which had seemed to her too young to take an oath of. Loki went and pulled up the mistletoe by the root, and, going to the thing, spoke to Hod, who was standing outside the ring, because he was blind. He asked him why he did not shoot at Balder, and was told that he could not see where Balder was, and, besides, he was weaponless. Loki then put the mistletoe in his hand, and bade him be guided by him and throw the rod at Balder. This he did, and Balder fell dead. The Aesir looked at each other in silence. None could dare take vengeance, so great a sanctuary was that place. They wept, but Odin was of all most grieved, knowing the harm that would befall the Aesir. Frigg then asked who would go down to Hel and offer her a ransom to release Balder. Hermod, the son of Odin, undertook this, and, mounting Sleipnir, rode away. He went for 9 nights through dark valleys to the river Gjöll and onto the Gjöll bridge, thatched with gold, and guarded by the maiden Modgud. She asked his name and race, and said that on the previous day Balder and 500 dead men had crossed, but the bridge thundered less with their tread than with his alone. Why did he ride on Hel way? To seek out Balder. Had she seen him? Yes. Balder rode over the bridge, and Helway lies down and to the north. Hermod rode on to Hel Gate, over which his horse leaped. Now he entered the hall, where Balder sat in the high seat. Next morning he besought Hel to let him go. She would only release him if all things, quick or dead, wept for him. Balder now let Hermod out of the hall. Nanna sent to Frigg a kerchief and to Fulla a gold ring. Hermod rode back to Asgard and told his tidings. Meanwhile, Balder's funeral had been celebrated. The Aesir brought his corpse to the sea and set it on Ringhorni, greatest of all ships. They would have launched it and set his pyre upon it, but it would not stir. A message was sent to Jotunheim to the giantess Jorokin. She came, riding a wolf bridled by a snake. Leaping off her steed, which Odin bade 4 berserkers tend, though they could not hold it till they had felled it, she pushed the boat so that fire burst from its rollers as it was thrust into the sea, and earth trembled. Thor, in his rage, would have broken her head with his hammer, had not the gods calmed him. The corpse was now laid on the ship. Nanna straightway died of grief, and was laid with Balder on the pyre, which was now kindled. Thor hallowed it with his hammer, when before his feet ran the dwarf Litter, whom Thor kicked into the fire. Odin was there, with Frigg, the Valkyries, and his ravens. Frey drove in his chariot with his boar Gullinbursti, or Slidrungtani. Heimdall rode Goltop. Freya drove her cats. Many of the frost giants and hill giants were also present. On the pyre, Odin laid the ringed Draupnir, and Baldur's horse was led to the fire with all his trappings. When Hemrod told his tidings to the Aesir, they sent messengers all over the world to pray that Baldur should be wept out of hell. People, living things, earth, stones, trees, metals, wept. As thou must have seen that all these things weep when they come out of the cold into the heat. As the messengers went home, they found a giantess sitting in a cave, Thok by name. They begged her to weep for Baldur. She refused, and here Snorri quotes a verse of a lost Eddic poem. With waterless tears will Thok weep, that Baldur ascends the pyre. Neither in life nor death loved I the Carl's son. Let hell hold what she has. Thok was Loki. Snorri then relates the vengeance taken by the gods on him. He also tells of Baldur and Hod in the renovated world. His narrative is based on poems now lost, the stanza about Thok being one of these, on the Eddic poems, and on the Hughdrupa, already cited. The Eddas do not tell how Vali took vengeance on Hod, but this is assumed, and in Yndlod asserted. Thus, Snorri gives as one of the kennings for Hod, foe of Vali, and for Vali himself, foe and slayer of Hod. As we have seen, the poetic references to Baldur's death do not mention Loki as the agent who caused Hod's action. If Hod had merely been the unwitting slayer, there would have been no reason for seeking an avenger to put him to death. In Snorri's narrative, where he acts under Loki's advice, vengeance is taken not on him, but on Loki. In the earlier form of the myth, before 1000 AD, Hod alone was responsible for Baldur's death. The story of Baldur and Hod is also told by Saxo Grammaticus, Hod being called by him Hotherus, and he is a son of Hodbrod, king of Sweden, and fosterling of Gevar, king of Norway. Hotherus was skilled in all accomplishments, and these so pleased Nanna, daughter of Gevar, that she fell madly in love with him. Baldur, Odin saw Nanna bathing, and he desired to have her, as Frey did on seeing Gerd, resolving to slay Hotherus. Hotherus, led astray by a mist when hunting, came to a lodge where certain Virgines Sylvestres, or wood maidens, greeted him by name. They told him that by their guidance and auspices the fortunes of war was mainly determined. They took part invisibly in battles, and secretly assisted their favourites to victory, for they could win victory or inflict defeat as they willed. They told him of Baldur's love for Nanna, but counselled him not to attack him in war, for he was a demigod, semi-deus, sprung secretly from celestial seed. Lodge and maidens now vanished, and Hotherus found himself in the open fields. Hotherus, much amazed, told Gevar of this, and asked him for Nanna. Gevar said that he would gladly favour him, but feared Baldur's wrath, and he also had asked for her. Baldur's body was proof against steel, but, said Gevar, there was a sword which would cause his death, as well as a bracelet which had the power of increasing its owner's wealth. These were in the possession of Miming, a satyr of the woods. The way to his abode was full of obstacles, over frozen ground. Hotherus must harness a car with reindeer, and, having reached the place, pitch his tent so that its shadow would not fall on Mimic's cave, and, by the unusual darkness, prevent his coming out. Hotherus followed these instructions, and when Miming emerged from the cave, he aimed a spear at him and laid him low. Then he bound him and demanded the sword and bracelet, which Miming now gave to him. Incidents are told of war with Gelder, king of Saxony, who coveted these treasures, and of assistance given to Helgi, king of Helgoland, to gain Thora, daughter of the king of the Finns and Perms. Meanwhile, Balder had sued for Nanna and was bidden by Gewart to learn her own mind. She would not be moved, and said that a god could not wed a mortal. Gods were apt to break their pledges. Hotherus, with Helgi's aid, joined battle with Balder at sea. Odin, Thor, and all the gods fought for Balder. Thor with his club, or clava, was carrying all before him, when Hotherus, clad in an invulnerable coat, cut the club in two, thus rendering it useless. The gods with Balder took to flight. Even Saxo is staggered by this, but he says that antiquity vouches for it. Soon after, fortune turned and Balder defeated Hotherus, but was so tormented by dreams in which phantoms took the form of Nanna that he fell into sickness, and had to be driven about in a four-wheeled carriage. Hotherus took possession of Denmark, joining it with Sweden. Balder came to Denmark, the people there accepting him. Hotherus was again defeated, retiring to Sweden in despair. In a wild forest he once more met the Wood Maidens, who had formerly given him an invulnerable coat, as we now learn. He told them of his defeats and upbraided them with breach of faith. They said that though he had been defeated, he had inflicted as much loss on the enemy as they had on his forces. Victory would soon be his, if he could obtain a food of great deliciousness devised to increase Balder's strength. Hotherus plucked up courage, and now Balder and the Danes opposed him in battle until night ended the fight. During the darkness, Hotherus went to spy on the foe, and learned that 3 maidens had gone out, carrying Balder's sacred feast. Running after them, for their footsteps could be traced in the dew, an elfin trait, he entered their dwelling, saying that he was a musician, one of the company of Hotherus. He played to them, entrancing them with his music, another elfin trait, and at the same time he saw that the venom of 3 serpents was drooping from their mouths on Balder's food, thus dowering it with magic strength. Out of kindness, 2 of the maidens would have given him a share of the food, but the eldest forbade it, saying that Balder would be defrauded if the strength of his enemy were increased. But these nymphs gave him a belt and a girdle, which ensued victory. On his return, he met Balder and plunged his sword into him, leaving him half dead. On the night following, Proserpine, or Hel, stood by Balder, and promised that on the morrow he would have her embraces. In 3 days he died, and was given a royal funeral by the Danes, his corpse being laid in a barrow made by them. Saxo then tells how, in his day, certain men, chief of whom was one Harold, sought to open the barrow to find treasure, but were stricken with panic. It split open, water poured from it, and flooded the land. The guardian gods of the place, Landvættir, or perhaps the Haugbui, thus terrifying the seekers, but, as Saxo believes, with a magic and phantasmal flood, not an actual one. Saxo gives interesting information about places connected with Balder. A heaven, the name of which he does not mention, recalls the story of Balder's defeat at sea, perhaps Balderslee, the traditional name of a village in Schleswig, though it may be Balsnes, formerly Baldersnes, on the island of Hitteren in Norway. After conquering Hotherus, Balder pierced the earth and opened a spring at which his men quenched their thirst. The traces of the spring at Baldersbrond, a village near Roskilde, were thought to exist in Saxo's time. Later tradition said that it was formed by a stroke of the hoof of Balder's horse. Saxo next tells how Odin began to inquire regarding vengeance for Balder's death, and gives the story of his affair with Rinda, which has already been related. Saxo's narrative both resembles and differs from the Eddic account of Balder. The protagonists, Balder and Hod, Hotherus, are the same, though Hotherus is not one of the Aesir, but son of a king. As in the earlier Eddic myth, Loki does not appear, nor is Hotherus blind. Balder is slain by Hod by means of the mistletoe which grows at Valhall and is sought there by Loki, Edda, by means of a magic sword sought by Hotherus in the far north, Saxo. Balder's safety is secured by oaths taken of all things not to harm him, Edda. He is invulnerable because of magic food and safe for being wounded by miming sword, Saxo. In the Eddas, he is troubled by dreams. So, in Saxo's account, he is troubled by dreams of Nanna and has a vision of hell. The vengeance motive appears in both. Rind has a son Vali or Bose to Odin, who overcame her by spells. On the other hand, Hotherus seems to be Saxo's hero, and Balder is not presented in a favorable light. Nanna becomes wife of Hotherus. In the Edda, she is wife of Balder. The cause of the enmity between the two is not given in the Edda. In Saxo, it is rivalry for Nanna, and later, strife for the possession of Denmark. In Saxo too, the gods fight against the hero Hotherus, and years after, he is slain by Bose, who himself dies of his wounds. The oath taken from all things to weep Balder out of hell and Hermod's visit to hell are lacking in Saxo. Balder is buried, not burned on a pyre. The pyre on a ship is transferred to Gelder, who was slain in the war, and set by Hotherus on the corpses of his men, laid on a pyre of ships. The wood maidens and the three nymphae who prepare Balder's magic food are not in the Eddic story. Saxo's narrative is mainly euhemeristic, save that Balder is a demigod in the earlier part at least, and the gods fight for him. The action takes place on Earth, and each protagonist has his army and fleet. The problems here are: is Saxo making use of a Norse or of a native Danish source or sources? Has he changed the myth of the gods into a saga about heroes? Was there a form of the Balder story which had no reference to the gods? Why should Balder be so well spoken of in the Eddas, but regarded unfavorably by Saxo? Definite solutions of these problems are hardly possible. The native Balder saga is maintained by Kaufmann, who thinks that the saga told of heroes, one of whom, Balder, was a demigod, but that, on reaching Iceland, it became a myth of the gods, modified by Christian influences. Others regard Saxo's source as Icelandic or partly Danish, partly Norse, and think that he or his source had euhemerized a myth of the gods. Saxo's narrative seems to indicate two sources. In one of these, mainly mythical, the quarrel between Balder and Hotherus is about Nanna. The gods intervene, yet Balder is put to flight, this narrative probably ending with his death and burning on a pyre, this being transferred to King Gelder. In the other, completely euhemerized, there are no gods. Balder and Hotherus are mortals, and the quarrel is about the possession of Denmark. Not impossibly, Saxo's narrative may be based on a form of the Balder myth of earlier date than the Eddic. The references in Voluspa and in Snorri, or his source, to the mistletoe by which Balder was slain do not seem to have been written by men familiar with this plant, which is described as a tree, not a parasitic plant on a tree. In Saxo, Balder is slain with a magic sword. No name is given to it, as was usual with magic swords, but in other documents we hear of a called Mistletoe. Thus, in the Romundar saga Greipsonar, Hormund possesses the sword Mistletoe, which he took from a berserker or his ghost out of a hill. Two magicians, Bilder and Voli, Balder and Vali, oppose him. Bilder is slain. Voli hurls Romund's sword out of his hand, wounds him, but is himself slain. Romund loved Swanhit. Bilder and Voli would not permit him to be her bride. The story thus bears some resemblance to Saxo's narrative of Hotherus, Balder, and Bose, Vali. In composite words, Tain is sword, as in Leivatain, the name of the sword by which alone Vithofnir could be killed, as Balder could be slain only by miming sword. The sword name might easily be mistaken for that of the plant, which would then be supposed to be the instrument of Balder's death. The meaning of the Balder myth has been sought in many directions, and German and Scandinavian scholars have suggested numerous interpretations for it, evolving many new myths in the process. The myth, like others existing in comparative isolation, must be more or less of a sealed book. Budge's hypothesis that an earlier Balder myth was reconstructed with stress laid on the fundamental moral elements of life as a result of the influence of English and Irish Christianity on the heathen Norsemen in the West, is worked out in great detail. Balder is identified with Christ. All the stress is laid on his death. While the hypothesis is ingenious, the elements of the new myth taken over from Christian sources, biblical, theological, legendary, are too numerous and too various for the theory to be convincing. One would also have thought that a Balder restored from hell and death would have formed part of a myth due to Christian ideas, as our Lord's resurrection and conquest of death and Hades had such a large place in Christian thought. Miss Philpotts, who sees in many of the Eddic poems the words of folk drama, and considers that a lost poem in dialogue form about Balder's death constituted a folk play representing the slaying of a god, would like to believe that Balder rose again, or that the representation of his funeral and the general weeping would have effect in inducing him to return. But if one thing is clearer than another in the Eddic references to Balder, it is that he does not return, and cannot return. Only after the doom of the gods does he appear in the renewed world. The name of Balder, whether god or hero, is thought to occur in the Merseburg charm, which tells how Fol and Woden rode to the wood, Balder's colt there wrenched its foot. If so, this would prove that Balder was known in Germany. The question is whether Balder is here a personal name or an appellative meaning lord and referring to Odin, whose horse would then be in question. Grimm found place names in Germany constructed, as he thought, both from Fol and Balder, and he connected the name Fol with that of the Celtic Belenus, a god of life, Slavic Belboch, white god, and Lithuanian Baltas, a white. He considered that Fol and Balder were differing forms of one word. The enigmatic Fol has also been explained as Apollo, possibly an early interpretatio romana of a German builder, or as Espol, or as a native German god, or as the name of Wodan's horse. The name Balder appears in Anglo-Saxon genealogies as Baldag, Baldag, and once as Balder, son of Woden. The Bealdor, Baldor, akin to these names, like Balder, meant prince or lord, though Balder means the white or shining one, and Baldag means bright day. The only indication of a cult of Balder occurs in the 14th century Fridtjof Saga, which speaks of a temple in Baldershog in Norway, enclosed by a fence. It contained many images, and Balder was most revered. Neither men nor oxen must do mischief there, nor sexual relations occur. On festivals, the images were anointed by women. This notice is generally regarded as fictitious. Place names in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark show traces of Balder, and he is still named in Danish folklore. The name of the plant, Baldersbra, is widespread in Scandinavia, but is applied to different plants. Chapter 11. Loki. Loki is the son of giants and is yet included among the gods. Snorri gives a detailed account of him and relates several myths in which he plays a part. He is mentioned in Voluspa, Thrumskvita, Humskvita, Svipdagsmal, Reginsmal, Yunloljod, and Baldur's Draumar, and he is the subject of Lokasenna. Some of the notices in these poems are included in Snorri's references. Two of the myths in which Loki plays a part are the subject of poems by Eilif Gudrunarsson and Thjodolf of Hvin, those of Thor and Geirrod, and of Idun and Thjazi. A third skald, Ulf Uggason, wrote a poem on Heimdall and Loki, cited by Snorri. Apart from these notices, Loki is not mentioned, example in the sagas, though his name survived in folk tradition. Snorri says of him, "Included among the Aesir is he whom some call the slanderer of the Aesir, or the author of deceit and the shame of gods and men. He is named Loki, or Lot. He is son of the giant Farbauti and the giantess Lofi, or Nal. His brothers are Bylast and Helblindi. To outward appearance Loki is beautiful and comely, but evil in disposition and ill in nature. He excelled in sleight and had stratagems for all occasions. He often brought the Aesir into great difficulties, but then delivered them with his cunning. His spouse is called Sigyn, and their son is Nari or Narfi. Loki joined in adventures with Thor, the visit to Utgard Loki, and to the giant Thrym. He was the cause of Thor's combat with Geirrod and his daughters. He was also joined with Odin and Hoenir in the work of creating the first pair, in connection with Andvari's treasure and in the story of Idun. Hence, he is called the friend of Odin, the staunch friend of Hoenir, by Thjodolf of Hvin. In Lokasenna, he recalls to Odin that in earlier days they had mixed their blood in the rite of blood brotherhood, and Odin had promised to pour no ale unless it were brought for both. In the same poem, Frigg bids Odin and Loki preserve silence on the deeds they had done long ago. Idun reminds Bragi that Loki had been chosen as wish son, or adopted son, by Odin. In a skaldic poem quoted in Heimskringla, Odin is called Lopt's friend, and Snorri speaks of him as evil companion and benchmate of Odin and the Aesir. Some have thought that Saxo's Myth-Othin may have been Loki in disguise. In the Sorlathattur, 13th century, Loki, son of a peasant Farbauti and his wife Lofi, who was thin and meager and hence called Nal or Needle, is caustic, cunning, and tricky. He became Odin's serving man. Odin always had a good word for him, though he often laid heavy tasks upon him, all of which he performed. Loki knew almost everything that happened and told it to Odin. This is introductory to the story of Loki stealing the Brisinga men from Freya. Snorri's statement that Loki got the gods into trouble but saved them by his cunning is illustrated by different myths. The demand of the giant artificer who rebuilt Asgard that the gods should give him Freya and the sun and moon was believed by them to have been suggested to him by Loki, and they adjudged him worthy of death unless he found means of evading the demand. He then changed himself into a mare, which was pursued by the giant's helpful stallion, Swadilfari. This caused the work to be suspended, and it was not completed in the agreed time. Thor slew the giant, and some time after, Loki gave birth to Sleipnir, Odin's horse. Again, by means of Loki's agreement with the giant Thjazi, he brought the goddess Idun into his power. When the gods discovered this, Loki was threatened with torture or death. He escaped by borrowing Freya's feather dress, flying to Jotunheim and bringing back Idun, whom he transformed for the occasion into a nut. The Aesir slew Thjazi when he pursued Loki to Asgard, but in Lokasenna, Loki claims to have been himself first and last in the fight with the giant. When Thjazi's daughter Skadi came to Asgard to avenge her father, Loki caused her to laugh, one of the terms of reconciliation demanded by her. When Loki flew to Geirrod's abode in Frigg's feather dress and was there captured and starved by him, he ransomed his life by promising to bring Thor there without his hammer or girdle of strength. Here, however, Thor required no stratagem on Loki's part in order to overcome Geirrod. Odin, Hoenir, and Loki were brought into the power of Hreidmar after Loki had slain his son in the form of an otter. Odin sent Loki to Svartalfheim, and there he captured the dwarf Andvari, who was in the form of a fish, and forced him to give up his treasure. This treasure was to form the god's ransom to Hreidmar, and it was to cover the otter's skin completely. The dwarf begged to be permitted to keep one ring, but Loki took it also, and he then declared that it would be the ruin of everyone who came into possession of it. Returning with the gold, Loki gave it to Odin, who covered the skin with it, but retained the ring. One of the hairs of the otter's nose remained uncovered, and Hreidmar insisted on it being covered, so Odin had to give up the ring. Loki now said that both ring and treasure would be a curse to every possessor of them. Snorri tells this story, but it is also the subject of Reginsmal, where the otter is called Otr, and Loki borrows Rand's net in order to catch Andvari, who says that the gold, not the ring, will be a curse. When Loki cut off Sif's hair out of mischief, Thor would have broken all his bones, had he not sworn to get the black elves to make Sif hair of gold, which would grow like other hair. In Thrumskvita, Loki, by crafty counsel, aids Thor to recover his hammer from Thrym. We are not told that Loki had caused the hammer to be stolen, but this may once have been the introduction to the story. Two forms of the story of Loki's theft of the Brisinga men from Freya are given. One is that related in the Thorlathatter, already cited. The other is obscurely referred to in a poem, a fragment of which is cited by Snorri, and in Snorri's account of Heimdall. Here Loki has apparently stolen it from Freya for his own purposes. Heimdall contends with him for it, and both are in the form of seals. Loki does mischief for mischief's sake. He is a thief of the Brisinga men, or he causes theft Idun and her apples. He dislikes others to be praised, even as a servant, and when he slew Fimfeng at Aegir's banquet. He is foul-mouthed and slanderous, as Lokasenna shows. Some account must be given of the contents of this poem. The prose introduction tells how Aegir invited many of the gods and elves to a feast. All went well until Loki, angry at the guests praising Fimafeng for his ability, slew him. The gods shook their shields and howled at Loki, and drove him out to the forest. At this point, the poem begins. Loki has returned and asks Eldir of what is going on in the hall. Eldir tells how the talk is of weapons and war, and that none has a friendly word for him. Loki says he will go in, bringing hatred to the gods and mixing venom with their ale. He enters and says that he has come from a far journey and asks for a drink. The gods are silent, till Bragi speaks and says that there is no place for him here. Loki appeals to Odin on the ground of their old brotherhood sworn in the morning of time, and Odin bids Vidar find a place for the wolf's father, lest he should speak evil. Vidar obeys, and Loki pledges all present. Hail to the Aesir, hail to the Asyniur, and all the holy gods, save only to that one of them, Bragi, sitting there on the bench. The poem now takes the form of a flyting between Loki and most of the guests present, in which much scurrility is spoken, and many mythological incidents, some of them otherwise unknown, are referred to. Bragi is accused of cowardice. Idun begs him to weigh Loki's kinship with Odin and speak no taunt to him. Loki turns on her and accuses her of an amour with her brother's slayer. She does not refute this taunt, but merely tries to calm Bragi, who was overcome with ale. Gefjun now intervenes and begs that no banding of words will continue, for Loki is known as a slanderer and hates everyone. Loki accuses her of misconduct with a youth who gave her a necklace. Odin tells Loki that he is mad to raise Gefjun's anger, for she knows men's destinies just as Odin himself does. Loki turns on Odin and tells him that he does not justly assign victory, and often gives it to him who deserves it least. Odin says this may be, but Loki had been 8 winters under the earth milking cows in woman's form, and even giving birth to children. Loki retorts that Odin had once wrought magic spells in the guise of a witch in Samsey, or Samso, north of Funen. These two taunts, a man bearing children as a woman, a man taking a woman's form, were not uncommon in the Scandinavian north, but were regarded as most deadly insults. Gods and goddesses in turn address Loki and strive to silence him, but in vain. He accuses Frigg of misconduct with Odin's brothers Vili and Ve, and when she says that if Balder were alive, he would fight with him, Loki boasts that it is he who caused his death. Freya, a witch strong in evil, is accused of sharing her favors with all the gods and Alfar, and with being her brother's lover. Njord intervenes, wondering why this womanish god, who has borne children, should come here. Loki taunts Njord with being a hostage from the Vanir, and with having a son, Frey, by his sister. Tyr now says that Frey is best of heroes. Loki bids him be silent, for he is no peacemaker, and had lost his stand by the Fenris wolf, and his wife had a son by Loki, for which crime no fine was ever paid. Frey reminds Loki that the wolf is bound till the doom of the gods, and that soon he too will be fettered if his tongue is not quiet. Loki says that Frey bought Gerd with gold and his sword, and now weaponless must await Muspel's sons when they ride through Mirkwood. At this point, Bugvir, Frey's servant, intervenes, and says that if he were of such birth as Frey, he would crush Loki to marrow and break all his bones. Loki taunts him, little creature that he is, with cowardice. Now Heimdall speaks and tells Loki he is drunk. Skadi says that soon the gods will bind Loki with his son's bowels. Loki cries that he was first and last among those who slew her father, and reminds her of his amour with her. Sif comes forward, pours ale for Loki, and says that she at least is blameless, but she also is reminded of misconduct with him. Bela, wife of Bugvir, cries that the mountains are shaking, and Thor, absent slaying trolls, is coming, and will silence the slanderer. She is also vilified, and now Thor enters and bids Loki, wretched wight, be silent, or his hammer will close his mouth. Loki says he need not be threatened so much. He will be less fierce when he fights the Fenris wolf. Thrice again does Thor threaten him. Loki still taunts him, with hiding in a giant's glove, and with his difficulty in opening Skirmir's wallet. Finally he says that he has spoken all he wished to say. Now he will go, because Thor is such a great fighter, but he warns Aegir that no more feasts will he give, for the fire will soon consume all that is here. A prose conclusion which is out of place, as Loki's imprisonment followed on Baldur's death, tells how he hid as a salmon in Franang's waterfall, where the gods caught him. He was bound with the bowels of his son Vali, and his son Narfi was changed into a wolf. Skadi fastened a venomous snake over his face, so that its poison dropped on it. Sigyn, his wife, who was included among the Asunir by Snorri, held a shell under the poison, but when she drew it away full of venom, some drops fell on Loki's face. He then struggled so much that all the earth shook, and that is called an earthquake. This poem belongs to the pagan period, 10th century, and was written by a pagan who knew the old myths, and who treats the deities with a kind of Aristophanic humor. These myths were discreditable, but like the Greek poets condemned by Plato, he does not hesitate to tell them. The prose introduction is of later date, for the poem itself tells how Loki had come from a long journey late to the feast, and had thus not been expelled for slaying Fimafeng. The gods receive him coldly, knowing his enmity to them. In spite of his dexterity and scurrility, none of the gods dare silence him, not even Odin. Thor alone, when he enters, and not even he immediately, can do this. Was the poem written by a Thor worshipper? Lokasenna shows Loki at enmity with all the gods, though he is plainly shown to be a blood brother of Odin. As clearly is he called the father of Fenris Wolf. Loki's wife was Sigyn, their sons Vali and Narfi. But in Hyndlul-Yod, his amour with the giantess Angrboda resulted in the birth of the Fenris wolf and the Midgard serpent. To these, Snorri adds a third, Hel. When the gods learned that these were being nourished in Jotunheim, and knew that they boded ill to them from their mother's blood, still more from their fathers, Odin sent gods to bring them to him. The Midgard serpent was now cast into the sea, and lies about all the land. Hel was cast into Niflheim. The Fenris wolf was bound. Hyndlul-Yod also tells of Loki's eating the cooked heart of a woman which he found in the embers. Through this he became with child, and gave birth to a monster. Nothing further is known of this myth, nor of that of which Odin speaks in Lokasenna. Loki as a cow-maid under the earth for 8 winters, and there bearing children. This has been explained as a nature myth. Loki is the subterranean fire, regarded as female, producing vegetation through warmth. The 8 winters should be regarded as 8 winter months during which frost reigns and warmth retreats within the earth and works in secret. The cows which Loki milks are warm springs. Loki's transformations were numerous, into a mare, a seal, a fly on 2 occasions, a flea, a milkmaid, a woman, a giantess, a salmon. By means of the feather dress, he became a bird. Loki's worst action, showing him as foe of the gods, is found in the myth of Balder. Here he plays an evil part, without any compensating good. Balder's death, brought about by him, as already told, brings near the doom of the gods. This led to Loki's punishment. He ran off and hid in a mountain, making a house with 4 doors, so that he could see in all directions. He transformed himself into a salmon by day and hid in Farnang Falls. When he sat in the house, he took twine and knitted meshes as a net is made. When he found that the Aesir were at hand, Odin having seen his hiding place from Lichtskjalf, he cast the net into the fire, and leaped as a salmon into the stream. The Aesir went into the house, and there Kvasir saw the ash made by the burning net, and realized that it was a device for catching fish. The Aesir now made one of the same pattern, and, by its means, tried to catch Loki, who evaded them, until Thor waded to midstream. When Loki tried to leap over the net, he caught him. Loki slipped through his hand, but Thor was able to grip him by the tail. Hence the salmon has a tapering tail. The Aesir now took Loki's sons, and changed Vali into a wolf. He tore his brother Narfi to pieces, and with his bowels the gods bound Loki to 3 flat stones set on edge in a cave. These bonds turned to iron. The rest of this myth is given by Snorri, as it is told in the prose appendix to Lokasenna. Loki now lies in bonds till the doom of the gods. The Sibyl refers to this in Voluspa. Bound saw I in the hot springs grove a monstrous form, the repulsive Loki. There sat Sigyn sunk in pain for the woe of her spouse. At the doom of the gods, Loki breaks forth. To this, the dead seeress, consulted by Odin about Baldur's dreams, refers. No one shall know consult her until Loki frees himself, shakes off his fetters, and the destroyers come to the doom of the gods. How he breaks loose is not told, but Voluspa describes how he stands at the hem of a ship with the people of Hel. Snorri gives further details. Loki, Rum, and the frost giants come forth. The champions of Hel follow Loki, who fights with Heimdall, each slaying the other. Thus Loki acts as opponent of the gods. The myth of Loki's bonds resembles one in Iranian mythology. The hero Thraitana conquered the dragon Azi Dahaka and bound him to the rock Damavand. There he lies till the last day, meanwhile causing earthquakes by his struggles. In the end he breaks loose and takes part with hosts of evil against the gods. We have seen that Thor and Loki visited Utgard, the giants' region, where its lord, Utgard Loki, practiced deception on them. While it is possible that Loki's name has been used in the name of the lord of Utgard, it can hardly be that he, Loki, and Logi, fire, which devours all, are one and the same being. Loki is as prominent in the story as the others. Snorri gives several kennings for Loki, based on his relationships and his deeds. He is foe of the gods, the sly god, slanderer and cheat of the gods, the bound god, thief of the giants, of Brisingamen, of Idun's apples. Other by-names are Wolf's father, the cunning Loki. He calls himself Lopt, and this name is also given to him by others. Its meaning is the airy one, or it is connected with Loptelder, or lightning. The name Lodur, which occurs only in Voluspa, as that of the associate of Odin and Hoenir, is generally supposed to be an earlier name of Loki, who was companion and friend of Hoenir, according to Theodulf of Hvin. This name is regarded as equivalent to Lupurar, or the fire-bringer. Loki's original nature has been sought in the meaning of his name, which may be connected with Logi, German Lohi, or fire. Hence, he is a fire demon, fire having the same destructive power as he delighted in. The name has also been derived from Lucifer, a name of the devil, and his personality regarded as a reflection of the devil's. Others connected it with Luka, to close, to bring to an end, Lok, the end. Hence Loki would be the one who closes or brings to an end, because his deeds lead up to the end of all, the doom of the gods. None of these meanings is quite satisfactory, though the suggestion that Loki was originally a fire demon has some evidence in its favor. His father is Farbauti, the dangerous striker, that is, the storm. His mother is Laufey, the leafy isle, or Nal, needle, the needle tree or fir tree. Loki is a creation of the storm, which, in lightning, brings down fire on the wooded isle. Or again, referring to the primitive production of fire by friction, by means of the fire drill, Farbauti is the piece of stick, the drill, which by rubbing on a soft piece of wood, Laufey, produces fire. Here again, these meanings are problematical. Loki's twofold nature is undoubted. He is tricky and destructive, yet he has the power to set things right. He is a friend of the gods, yet he brings trouble upon them. In addition to this, he appears in darker colors. He is father of monsters, a base slanderer, the cause of Baldur's death, a monster chained under the earth, the leader of hosts of evil against the gods. Thus, for some reason not known to us, Loki becomes monstrous and sinister, whereas he was merely mischievous at first. If he was originally a fire demon, fire is both beneficent and dangerous, and in this may be seen both the twofold aspect of Loki's character and also his later emphatically destructive aspect. If he represents fire, then his giving vital heed to Ask and Embla would be appropriate. Whether or not we are to regard him as a spirit of fire, his twofold aspect, no less than other traits, suggests the characteristics of elfin beings. These other traits are shape-shifting, skill in theft, craft, and trickiness. He is beautiful in form, but of evil nature. He travels swiftly through the air either by means of birds' plumage or shoes, by which he ran through air and over water. He is chosen to go to the dwarves' land in order to get them to ford Sif's hair. His conduct to these dwarves is of an elfish kind. He is also associated with dwarves in the making of Menglod's Hall, and, like a dwarf, he forged the sword Leivatein in the underworld. We may thus conclude that Loki, whether originally an embodiment of fire or not, was a spirit of an elfin kind, raised to divinity and included among the Aesir, just as Aesir and elves are constantly named together. He was also an embodiment of the mischief maker, so common in all states of society, whose mischief has often dire results for himself or others. He is like the Greek Thersites, or the Conan of the Celtic Fionn saga. Such persons were common in actual life. Why should there not be one of them associated with the gods? If Loki was an elfin fire spirit, then he might have been regarded as personifying the volcanic fires known in Iceland. This has been already hinted at in the interesting interpretation of the milkmaid myth. Some later folklore is also thought to point to Loki's connection with fire or heat. A Norse saying, "When the fire crackles," is, Loki is beating his children, and the skin of the milk is thrown into the fire as a dole. On hot days, when the air shimmers, or in spring, when the mists rise from the ground in the sunshine, a Danish saying is, "Loki is driving out his goats." The sun appearing through clouds and drawing up moisture seems to be referred to in the sayings, "Loki drinks water," or "Loki is passing over the fields." In Sweden, when a little child's tooth falls out, it is thrown into the fire with the words, "Loke, Loke, give me a bone tooth. Here is a gold tooth." In Iceland, chips and refuse for firing are called Loki's chips, and subterranean sulfur fumes, Loki's vapor. The elfish Loki rose in character and became the companion of gods. Ulrich tried to trace different conceptions of Loki in myth and folklore. Thus, he regarded him as in part a once beneficent being. As stealer of Brisinga men, he is the Promethean stealer of fire for the benefit of mankind, this famous jewel being supposed to represent fire. Brisingr, fire. Brising, bonfire. Though it is never stated that this necklace did good to men. Loki also invented the fishing net, a myth inserted in Snorri's account of his capture. The myth of Loki's binding and breaking loose before the doom of the gods has been, by some, traced to the account in Revelation of Satan's binding and breaking out of the abyss. But there may already have been in the north myths of a monstrous being bound under the earth, whose movements caused earthquakes, a not uncommon myth. If such a being bore a name resembling Loki's, then the two would tend to be confused, and the elfish Loki would become more demoniacal and monstrous, parent of monsters, foe of the gods, and cause of Baldur's death. We have seen the close resemblance of the Iranian myth of Asi-Dahaka, found also in Armenia, to that of Loki. Ulrich maintained that the Eddic myth of Loki chained and breaking loose had its provenance in a series of myths of giants or animals bound and causing earthquakes, found in the Caucasus region and radiating forth in all directions. The Iranian myth is one of the series, but such a myth may have been native to Scandinavia. If Loki owes some of his more monstrous traits to the early medieval devil, he is, on the whole, an original figure of Norse mythology, one of those beings who, possibly kindly in origin, is dowered with a more complex character as time goes on, and ends by being wholly sinister and monstrous. Loki's wife Sigyn is counted among the goddesses. Her function of guarding him from the venom of the snake may point to her being a guardian goddess against poison. To the more monstrous Loki, the giantess Angrboda was joined, and was the mother of monsters. Chapter 12. Lesser Gods. Hoynir. Nothing is known of a cult paid to this god, but what is said of him in the Eddas points to his being one of the old Aesir. Snorri gives no separate account of him, but mentions him mainly in connection with other gods. In Voluspa, he is associated with Odin and Lodur in the creation of Ask and Embla, giving them soul or reason, and the three gods are called mighty and benevolent. He is also joined with the same gods, if Lodur is Loki, in the stories of Idun and of Andvari. A ballad of the Faroe Islands introduces the same gods, calling them Ovin, Honir, and Lokhi. A peasant had lost his son to a giant at a game of draughts, and prayed the three gods to help him. Ovin made a field of barley spring up in a night, and hid the boy in an ear of the barley. When the giant cut this down, the ear fell from his hand, and Ovin brought back the boy to his father. Next, Hoenir hid him in a feather on the neck of one of the 7 swans. The giant caught them, but the feather fell out and the boy escaped. Finally, Loki changed him into an egg in a flounder's roe. This also escaped from the giant, who was slain by Loki. All this has been interpreted mythologically, but it is nothing more than the invention of a poet to whom the association of the 3 gods was known, making use also of a common folk tale motif. This association of the gods is remembered by the skalds. Hoenir is benchmate, friend, companion of Odin, and Loki is Hoenir's companion and staunch friend. Snorri calls Hoenir the swift god, the long-footed god, and the king of clay or moisture, or, as some interpret the Norse words, king of eld. What lies behind these titles is unknown, and the myths which may have given rise to them have not survived. In the saga fragment, Hoenir is called the most timorous of the Aesir. This may refer to the account of his being sent as a hostage to the Vanir, when his apparent godliness proved illusory, as already narrated. In this story he is a big, handsome being, but stupid, unlike the Hoenir who gave reason to ask an Embla. After the doom of the gods, Hoenir survives and appears in the renewed world. There he chooses the Hlaut Vipur, that is, a slip of wood with runes engraved on it. This perhaps signifies his knowledge of the future. Heimdall. Heimdall, or Heimdallr, is an enigmatic being, and he has been regarded as a mere creation of the skalds, a poetic form of the old heaven god. But this is to overemphasize the poverty of Teutonic polytheism, as well as the argument from silence. Though enigmatic, Heimdall stands out as an actual mythic being. Heimdall, also called Vindler, is included among the Aesir by Snorri and in Grimnismal. He is of the race of the gods, according to Yndluljóð, and a son of Odin. In the Eddic poems, he is whitest of the gods, and, like the Vanir, he knows the future. His abode is in Himinbjörg, where in a pleasant house he, the watchman of the gods, drinks mead. The name Himinbjörg, or Heaven Mountain, is still used in Norway for a steep mountain sloping down into the sea. Heimdall is the man mighty in arms, and, as watchman of the gods, he has a horn, the Gjallar horn, which meanwhile rests under the ash Yggdrasil, if the Völuspá poet is not here making it take the place of Odin's eye. It is curious that the divine watchman's horn should not be beside him. Before the doom of the gods, this horn will be blown as a warning. The human race, high and low, are Heimdall's children, or, as in Rigsthula, where he is called Rig, he is ancestor of the Jarls, yeomen, and thralls. He went along the shore and came to a dwelling, where he called himself Rig. There he begat a son Thrael, on his hostess Edda, and he was the first of the thralls. Then he went to another house, where Amma bore to him Karl, the first of the yeomen or carls. In the third dwelling he was received by Fathir and Muthir, and the latter became by him mother to Jarl, the first of the Jarls. As Rig, Heimdall is called the brave, old, wise god, the bold, robust walker, and he knows well to speak wise words. Heimdall is the kinsman of men, endowed with unusual strength, and is celebrated in weapons. He is son of 9 giantesses, Gjolp, Grape, Eistla, Ergjafa, Ulfrun, Angeia, Imd, Atla, and Jarnsaxa. This account of his parentage is given in Yndluljóð, and by the skald Wolfugason, as well as in a fragment of the lost Heimdallr Galdur, cited by Snorri. I am the offspring of 9 mothers, of 9 sisters am I the son. In Lokasenna, Heimdall opposes Loki, and is told by him to be silent, for in the old time an evil fate was fixed for him. Now he must stand with stiff neck and keep guard as watcher of the gods. We have already seen how he advised Thor to disguise himself as Freya and thus go to the giant Thrym. Snorri combines much of this and gives further details about Heimdall. He is the white god, great and holy, born of 9 sisters. He is also called Hallinskidi, or Ram, and Gullintani, or Golden Teeth. His horse is Gulltopp, Gold Top, on which he rode at Baldur's funeral. He dwells in Himinbjorg, close by Bifrost, at the end of heaven by the bridge head, where Bifrost joins heaven. He is warder of the gods, and sits there to guard the bridge from the hill giants. Less sleep does he need than a bird. By night or day he sees equally well 100 leagues. He hears grass growing on earth and wool on sheep, as well as everything that has a louder sound. He has the Gjallar horn, the blast of which is heard through all worlds. The statements regarding Heimdall as watchman of the gods point to the reality of his personality. The dualistic form of Eddic mythology, gods opposed by giants, may early have suggested this need of watchfulness, therefore of a watchman ever guarding the frontier of the gods' realm from the approach of their enemies, just as a watchman was needed against enemies among men. For this reason it is said of him that he needs little sleep, though this, as well as his miraculous sight and hearing, belongs to universal folk-tale formulae. Such powers are distributed among various beings who help a hero in his adventures. This white god, or whitest of the gods, may be a god of light, light being essential to such functions as his. As son of 9 giantesses, perhaps the 9 daughters of Aegir and Ran, who are the waves, though their names differ, he was born at the edge of the world. If we regard these giantesses as personifications of the waves, or possibly of mountains, Heimdall might be regarded as a personification of the day dawning out of the sea, or over the mountain that looked down upon it. Another suggestion regarding his birth is that the myth alludes to 9 reincarnations of the god. The Skalds call the sword Heimdall's head, for it is said that he was pierced by a man's head. This was told in the lost Heimdallar Galdur, and since then a head was called Heimdall's fate, and a sword man's fate. Heimdall's sword was also called Head. Does this mean that there was some myth of Heimdall's having been slain by a head? Or is it merely an obscure way of referring to his death at the future doom, where he and Loki slay each other? If the former, then Heimdall must have been reborn, for he is still to die at the last battle, and this would lend support to the theory of his 9 reincarnations. In Yunlol it is said of his 9-fold birth that he was nourished with the strength of earth, with the ice-cold sea, and with the blood of swine. As Heimdall was born at the world's edge, that is, where sea and land meet, this may account for the reference to earth and sea, while the blood of swine would mean sacrificial blood. The lines are believed by some editors to have been transferred to Yunlol from Guthrark Vita, where earth, sea, and swine's blood are components of the magic drink given by Grimhild to Gudrun. Heimdall is called the foe of Loki, the seeker of Freya's necklace, the frequenter of Vagasker and Singastein, where he fought with Loki for the necklace Brisingamen. According to Ulf Uggason's Hustrapa, Heimdall and Loki were then in the form of seals, and Snorri quotes some lines of the poem which refer to this without throwing much light upon it. Loki must have stolen and hid the necklace, perhaps in some cliff by the sea, and he and Heimdall, transformed to seals, fought for it, and Heimdall apparently recovered it. Examples of such transformation combats occur in Celtic and other mythologies. The enmity between Loki and Heimdall culminates at the doom of the gods, where each slays the other. As men are Heimdall's sons, as he is kinsman of men of all rulers, and holds sway over men, Heimdall is in some sense regarded as creator or progenitor, as well as ruler of men and orderer of their classes. In the prose introduction to Rigsthula, probably later than the poem itself, Rig, from Old Irish rig, or king, is identified with Heimdall, and it is said that all stories tell the narrative which is the subject of the poem. Some critics think that Odin, not Heimdall, is Rig. While this is possible, the references in the other Eddic poems to Heimdall in relation to men support the identification of the introduction. In the third son, Jarl, Rig took peculiar interest, calling him by his name, Rig Jarl, teaching him runes and bidding him possess his wide heritage. The poem serves as a eulogy of kingship and to trace the descent of a royal house to a god. Grimm compared Heimdall at Heaven's Bridge to the angel guarding paradise with a sword, and his horn blown before the doom to the trumpet blown by the angel at the last day. Heimdall's strife with Loki is a parallel to that of Michael and Satan. Such Christian conceptions might have influenced the myth of Heimdall, but granting a bridge from heaven to earth and an expected attack on the god's abode, nothing is more likely than that it should have a divine watchman with a horn. Of a cult of Heimdall nothing is known, though his name occurs in certain place names. Ul. Ul, or Uller, was son of Thor's wife Sif by an unknown father, and stepson of Thor, called Ul's glorious stepsire, and his kinsman. He is fair of face and has all the accomplishments of a warrior. Therefore, men do well to call on him in single combats. He is so excellent a bowman and snowshoe runner that none may vie with him. Hence he is called Snowshoe God, Bow God, Hunting God, and Shield God. This is Snorri's account of him. His ring is mentioned in Atlakvita as that on which oaths were taken, probably a ring attached to or laid on an altar stone, and the custom of swearing on such a ring is mentioned in sagas. Odin singles out Ul by name along with the gods when he is bound between two fires, as recounted in Grimnismal. Ul's favour and that of all gods has he, who first in the fire will reach. The dwelling can be seen by the sons of the gods, if one takes the kettle from its hook. Odin here refers to the torments he is suffering between the fires. Let someone draw away the kettle from its hook, and the gods will be able to look down through the roof opening which served as a chimney, and see his perilous position. Ul dwells in Yudalir, Yew Dales, an appropriate place for a god of the bow, since bows were made of yew. One manuscript of Snorri's Edda, in the passage which tells of the steeds of the gods, says that Ul had many horses. Ul's name means the lordly, the majestic, and is the equivalent of Gothic vulpus, or glory. The few notices regarding him suggest his former importance, waning before that of other gods. Many place names, especially in Sweden, contain his name, and show that his cult was widespread. As snowshoe god, Ul's original sphere would be the more northerly parts of Scandinavia, unless he is to be regarded as ruling more particularly in winter. He has been regarded as a Finnish god, or a god worshipped in the region where Finns and Scandinavians mingled. Skadi, who may have been a Finnish goddess, is also characterized by her snowshoes. Ul would thus be her male counterpart. The shield, according to the skulls, were the ship of Ul, that on which he travelled, a reference to a lost myth, though skjold or shield may be an error for skid or snowshoe, the snowshoes on which he journeyed over the snowfields. An interesting comment on this Skaldic periphrasis, which may point to its origin in folk custom, is found in what Plutarch says of the Cimbri when opposing the Romans in the Alps. They climbed to the tops of the hills and, placing their broad shields under their bodies, let themselves slide down the slopes, a primitive kind of toboggan. Oleris in Saxo, the equivalent of Ul, used a bone marked with runes to travel overseas, and quickly passed over the waters. This seems to mingle with the travelling on skates made of bone with the Skaldic conception of the shield as a ship. Ul took Odin's place when he went into exile and bore his name, as Saxo relates. This points to his high place, as does also the phrase, Ul and all the gods, in Grimnismal, where he is singled out by name as if of great importance. That he, as the glorious Goi, was a form of Tyrs, ousted by Odin, is doubtful. More likely he was a native Scandinavian, possibly Finnish, god, whose place and cult were taken by Odin, a fact indicated in Saxo's story of Odin and Oleris. Recent research in Scandinavian place names has caused some scholars to see in Ul and Frey a pair of alternating divine brothers, gods of fertility. They are believed to have been worshipped on two hills near Leira in Sealand, the place where a 9-yearly sacrifice formerly took place. These hills are the Hjudelhog and Frisjog, and their popular names as recorded 3 centuries ago point to the belief that Ul and Frey were buried there. These twin gods were associated in a fertility cult with goddesses, and the cult seems to have contained the representation of a ritual marriage. On a rock called Ullaber, or Ullarberg, near Ullensvang, within recent times a gathering was held on Midsummer Day, and a girl was dressed up as a bride. The close connection in one stanza of Grimnismal between Ul's abode Hjudalir and Frey's Alfheim, whereas those of other deities have each one stanza allotted to them, has also led to the supposition of a connection between Ul and Frey. Vidar. Vidar is the silent god, a son of Odin, Sigfather's mighty son. His mother is the giantess Grid, whom Thor visited on his way to Geirrod's land. Vidar is nearly as strong as Thor, and the gods trust him in all struggles, for he is their avenger. Snorri says that he is the divine dweller in the homesteads of the fathers. But Grimnismal speaks of his abode thus: underwood and luxuriant grass fills Vidi, Vidar's land. There springs the youth from the back of his horse, ready to avenge his father. The latter part of the stanza refers to Vidar's deed at the Doom of the Gods. As one of the Aesir present at Aegir's banquet, Vidar was bidden by Odin to rise up and let Loki sit down, in order that he might not speak words of contempt. Vidar obeyed and presented Loki with a cup of ale. He is the one god present who escapes the acid of Loki's biting tongue. At the Doom of the Gods, after the Fenris wolf swallows Odin, Vidar speeds to meet him and thrusts his sword into the monster's heart, thus avenging Odin. Snorri quotes this notice from Voluspa, but gives himself a different account. He has told how Vidar has a thick shoe, hence he is possessor of the iron shoe. When Odin met his fate, Vidar strode forth and set one foot, that on which he wears the shoe, on the lower jaw of the wolf. With one hand he seized the upper jaw and tore the two apart, killing the monster. This agrees with Vafthrud Nismal. He will tear the jaws of the wolf so that he will die. Hence Vidar is called foe and slayer of Fenris wolf, and avenger of the gods. With Vali he survives the conflict, unharmed by the sea and Surt's fire, and dwells in Ithavol. Though Snorri speaks of Vidar's shoe as of iron, he gives another description of it, taken from folk belief. The materials for this shoe have been gathering through the ages, the scraps of leather cut by men from their shoes at heel or toe. He who desires to aid the gods should throw these scraps away. This tradition, which resembles that about the ship Naglfjord, formed from dead men's nails, must be based on some folk custom. Out of these sparse data, and from the supposed source of the god's name, whether from Vid, forest, or from Vidi, the plain on which he dwelt, elaborate conceptions of Vidar have been formed. Kaufmann says, "In the dark solitude of the forest, the silent god watches over order and justice in the lives of the gods and men. He is the guardian of peace, and as such, the appointed judge of those who disturb it. He is the god who lives untouched by wrong. Silent and aloof he dwells, far from all crime, the Lord of righteousness. His temple among the Norwegians, as among the German tribe of the Semones in the time of Tacitus, was the forest with its darkness and awe. In him we recognize the Dies Requali Vahanus, the god dwelling in darkness." Kaufmann also identifies Vidar with Heimdall and Hoenir, all forms of one and the same god. On the other hand, Rodiger regards Vidar as the god of the heath land, widespreading, silent, remote. He is a divine personification of the heath, with its brooding silence and its undergrowth, its thick, grassy and mossy surface, symbolized by the indestructible shoe. While the ingenuity of these views does credit to the mythopoeic faculty of their authors, they are entirely hypothetical as far as Scandinavian mythology is concerned. Although no proof of a cult of Vidar exists, here again the god's name is found in place names, Vidarshof, Vidarsgarth, and the like. Bragi. Bragi, Odin's son and husband of Idun, is famous for wisdom, and especially for fluency and skill in speech. He knows most of skaldic art, or skaldskap, and hence, says Snorri, this art is called after him, Bragr, and the man or woman who excels in it is called Bragr man or woman. The word Bragr, however, which means both skaldic art and the foremost, is not derived from Bragi's name. Snorri gives the kennings for Bragi: husband of Idun, first maker of poetry, the long-bearded god. Hence, a long-bearded man was called Skegg, or Baird Bragi. In the Eddic poems, Bragi is mentioned thrice. He is best of skalds. Runes are said to be carved on his tongue. Both he and Idun were guests at Aegir's banquet. When Loki re-entered the hall, Bragi said that the gods would never give him a place at their board. Odin, on the ground of their pact of brotherhood, permitted Loki to have a place, and Loki bade all the gods hail, but accepted Bragi by name. Bragi said that he would give him a horse and sword from his hoard, and a ring, if he would refrain from making mischief among the gods. Loki said that he had none of these things, and that of all present he was the most cowardly in fight and most afraid of darts. Bragi retorted that were he outside the hall he would carry away Loki's head in his hand as a punishment for lying. Loki taunted him with being valiant on his bench, and ironically called him the bench-grazing Bragi. If he is angry, let him fight. A bold man does not sit considering. Idun now intervened and said that Bragi was drunk with ale. Whether Loki's accusation was based on a lost myth is unknown. Critics maintain that Bragi was a creation of the Skalds, or actually the poet Bragi Boddason, around 800 AD, thus apotheosized by them and regarded as Odin's son. This Bragi was most noted of all Skalds, though, on the other hand, he himself has been regarded as mythical. In Eiríksmal, circa 935 AD, Bragi, the god or the poet, is Odin's favorite poet. He wonders at the noise of a host approaching Valhall and thinks that it must be Balder returning. In Hakonar Mal, Odin bids Bragi and Hermod to go forth to meet the dead Hakon and invite him to enter Valhall. Bragi tells him how his brothers await him in Odin's hall and invests him with its honors. On the whole, Bragi may be regarded as distinct from the poet of that name. He would be worshipped by Skalds as god of poetry, like Ogma among the Irish Celts and his counterpart Ogmios among the Gauls. As god of poetry, he takes Odin's place, for to him this function was attributed, and, as the long-bearded god, or Sidskegja, he resembles him, for Odin himself was called Sidskeg and Langbode. In Odin's court, this divine skald, whose personality is at least so well marked as to be assigned Idun for a consort, after slaying her brother, a myth referred to in Lokasena but otherwise unknown, has the same place as the skald at a king's court, and he greets the heroic dead who enter it. His eloquence is emphasized by Snorri, and he is the narrator in Bragareidur and Skalskaparmal. In the first, he discusses the poetic art and its origin. In the second, he shows how poetry should be composed and tells a number of myths. The wood called Bragalund in Helgi Hundeslangbana is Bragi's wood. The cup drunk by the heir at a feast after the death of a king or jarl and in his memory was called Bragarfull, cup of the foremost, that is, of kings or jarls. Drinking it, an oath was taken by the heir, and he was then conducted to his father's seat. The same name was given to the cup drunk at sacrificial feasts, after those drunk to Odin, Frey, and Njord. A vow was made to perform some great deed which might become the theme of the song. In Helgak Vita Jorvard Sonar, Hayden refused an offer made to him by a troll wife on Yule Eve, and she said, "Thou shalt pay for this when thou emptiest the Bragarfull." That night he vowed at the drinking of the cup to possess Svava, the beloved of Helgi, but repented this so bitterly that he left home and wandered through wild regions. The name of this cup is sometimes connected with that of Bragi, as if it had been drunk in his honor, but it is rather derived from Bragar in the sense of the foremost, or the best, that is, king, chief, or hero. Forseti. Forseti, the president, he who has the first seat, the right-speaking god, is son of Balder and Nanna. His hall is called Glitnir, the glittering. It rests on golden pillars and the roof is decked with silver. There he dwells and sits in judgment, reconciling those who are at strife, and who come before him with quarrels arising out of lawsuits. He was thus a god of justice, one to whom the disputes of men must in some way have been submitted. The place name in Norway, Forsetilund, or Forseti's Grove, preserves his name and points to a seat of his cult. The Frisians worshipped a god Focete, who had a temple on the sacred island of Helgoland on Focete's land. Cattle grazing near it or anything about it might not be touched, and water from the sacred stream must be drawn in silence. Anyone profaning the temple was sacrificed to the god, according to the Frisian folklore. Saint Boniface had striven to convert the Frisians, but the heathen among them had put him to death. His successors carried on his work, but found the Frisians jealous of their temples, sacred springs, and holy places in wood fields or moorlands. In the early years of the 8th century, Willibrord, when in Helgoland, baptized some of the people in Focete's spring. His companions slew some of the sacred animals. The anger of the people was aroused. One of the party was offered in sacrifice, and the rest sent back into Frankish territory. Focete is assumed to be the same as Forseti, and is cult to have passed from the Frisians to the Norsemen, who had relations with them. The Norse poets then made him son of Balder. A curious story is connected by some students with this god. Charlemagne desired the 12 Aesgen from the 7 Frisian sealands to tell him where the Frisian law was. They declared that they could not do this, and asked for 2 days' respite, and then for 3 more. At the end of this time, being still unable to obey the command, they were doomed to punishment, but received the choice of death, slavery, or being set in a ship without sails or rudder. They chose the last, and one of them proposed to call on God for help. As Christ had appeared to his disciples through closed doors, so he would send one who would teach them what the law was and bring them to land. They prayed, and now a 13th person was seen among them, with an axe on his shoulder. By it means he steered the ship to land. He threw the axe on the shore, and there a well began to spring forth. Hence this place was called Axenthov. Then the stranger taught them the law and vanished. They now returned to Charlemagne and told him what the law was. This mysterious personage who thus revealed the Frisian law is presumed to have been Focete, giver of law and justice, though the axe would rather suggest Donar. Vali. Vali, or Ali, called brother of the Aesir, is son of Odin and the giantess Rind, who is counted as one of the goddesses by Snorri. Vali is described as daring in fight and a clever marksman. Like Vidar, he is said to be a dweller in the homesteads of the fathers. He was born expressly to avenge Balder's death. In Balder's Draumr, the seeress says to Odin, Rind bears Vali in the western halls. When 1 night old will Odin's son fight. His head he will not comb, nor his hand wash, till Balder's foe is laid on the pyre. Völuspá also says of him that Balder's brother is soon born, and repeats in almost identical words the passage in Balder's Draumr. The lesser Völuspá in Yndlólyod speaks of Vali as swift to avenge Balder's death, when he slew his brother's slayer. Hence, as Snorri says, Vali is called Balder's Avenger, foe and slayer of Hod. The Eddas relate nothing further of Vali's origin, nor of his act of blood revenge. In Saxo, Vali is called Bos, and the blood vengeance is long delayed. Bos dies of a wound received in his fight with Hotherus. The passage cited from the Edda suggests that while Balder's corpse was still on the pyre, his slayer's body was laid beside it. On the other hand, the vengeance seemed to be delayed. Vali accomplishes it when 1 night old, but does not cut his hair or wash his hand till it is completed. The latter points to a period of waiting, and is the heroic aspect of an oath of blood revenge or of the intention to do a doughty deed. The infant hero who arrives quickly at maturity and vigor is a commonplace of folk tale and hero tale, as with the heroes Cuchulainn, Fionn, Magni, son of Thor, Apollo, etc. Dekker and Nekkel explain Vali's name as derived from Wanelo, the little Van, as if he were one of the Vanir, while Nekkel assumes that Vali was the avenger, not of Balder, but of his father Frey. Such attempts at explaining away the statements of the Edda are futile. Siever's derivation of Vali from Vanula, or shining, does not agree with anything told of this god. Vali takes no part in the strife at the doom of the gods, but in the renewed world he shares with Vidar the seats of the gods. While Vidar and Vali are sons of Odin by giantesses, avengers, one of Odin, the other of Balder, and sharers of the blissful future, they are not necessarily identical, as has been maintained. That both are later creations of poetic fancy, that is to fit into the doom drama, is possible. In Svipdagsmal, the dead Groa recites protective charms to her son, among others one that Rind sang to Ran. Ran is here not the sea goddess, but, as the parallel demands, a hero and even a son of Rind. Hence Ran is assumed to be another name for Vali. The Eddas say little of Rind, but from the Swedish place name Vrindravi, or Rind Sanctuary, it is believed that she must have been the object of a cult. Hod. Hod, whose name nears war or battle, is son of Odin and is of great strength. He is the blind god among the Aesir. Gods and men would desire him not to be named, for the work of his hands will be long remembered. This work was Balder's death. Hence, he is Balder's opponent, or Balder's murderer. Snorri tells how Loki caused Hod to slay Balder. Of Vali's vengeance upon Hod, no myth has survived, and it is possible that in the earlier form of the Balder story, Loki was not the cause of Hod slaying Balder. Loki does not appear in Saxo's version of the story, as we have seen. The Voluspa poet and Snorri tell how Hod will sit down with Balder in peace in the renewed world. One of the periphrases for Balder is Hod's adversary, and this agrees with Saxo's story, in which Balder was adversary of Hotherus, or Hod, who is here a hero and king of Sweden, not a god. The kennings for Hod were the blind god, thrower of the mistletoe, companion of Hel, foe of Vali. A curious story of Detters as explaining the Balder myth is that Hod was really Odin. Balder and Vali were brothers, connected with Frey, Vali being the little Van, one of the Vanir. Odin, the one-eyed or blind god of war, sought to cause strife between the brothers. He placed his spear in the form of a mistletoe twig in Vali's hand. Vali threw it at Balder, who was slain. Chapter 13. Mimir. Among water spirits, Mimir is supreme and has a prominent position in the Eddic poems. If not a god, he is brought into close contact with gods, especially Odin, whose uncle he may have been. In the Voluspa, Odin pledged his eye with Mimir, presumably to obtain secret knowledge from him. The eye is hidden in Mimir's well, and Mimir daily drinks mead out of Odin's pledge. But in another stanza, a stream is said to issue from this pledge, and it waters the tree Mjotvid, which Snorri, in his reference to this verse, takes to be Yggdrasil. Mimir's well is thus under the tree, the well which in verse 19 is called Urd's well. The redactor of the poem which spoke of Odin's eye given as a pledge and hidden in a well beneath the tree which was watered by it, has added a new and contradictory verse. The well that is of the water spirit Mimir, and he daily drinks from this eye. As Boer says, the redactor replaces the clear nature picture of Odin giving a pledge in return for something else, that is, water which falls on the tree, with a meaningless one, that of Mimir drinking from the pledge. The pledge, Odin's eye, is generally regarded as the sun, the eye of the heaven god, seen reflected in the water or sinking into the sea, phenomena which may have given rise to the myth. Where the redactor speaks of Mimir's drinking from this pledge, it is thought of as a cup or shell, a quite different myth from that of the eye. From Snorri's account of this myth, Mimir's well is under that root of the ash Yggdrasil, which turns towards the frost giants. In it wisdom and understanding are stored. Mimir keeps the well and is full of ancient lore, because he drinks of the well from the Gjallar horn. Odin came and craved one draught of the well, but did not obtain it till he had given his eye in pledge. Then Snorri quotes the Voluspa stanza, which tells how Mimir drinks from Odin's pledge. This contradicts what has just been said about the Gjallar horn. There must have been different versions of the myth of Odin's eye and of Mimir's relation to it. In Svipdagsmal Mimamaid, the tree of Mimir is given as a name of the world tree. At the doom of the gods, Mimir's sons, that is, the rivers and brooks, are in violent motion. Another aspect of Mimir's is given in Vafthrudnismal. Mimir, called Hodmaimer, or Hill Mimir, or Mimir of the treasure, is owner of a wood, Hodmaimer's Holt, and in it are hidden a human pair, Lif and Liftrasir, life and he who holds fast to life. They survive the terrible Fimbul winter at the end of the world. Meanwhile, they feed on morning dew, and from them come the folk who will people the renewed earth. According to Snorri, who quotes this verse, this human pair lie hidden in the holt during the fire of Surth. Whether this holt or grove is identical with the world tree is not clear. It may have been regarded as existing underground at its roots where Mimir's fountain was. Another series of Mimir myths is connected with his head, cut off by the Vanir, as already told. Odin smeared it with words that it should not rot, and sang words of magic, or Galdra, over it, and gave it such might that it told him of hidden matters. In Sigurdrifumal, the Valkyrie Sigurdrifa instructs Sigurd in the wisdom of runes, and she says that he must learn thought runes, which Ropt or Odin devised from the fluid, which dropped from Heidrupnir's head and from Hodrofnir's horn. These are evidently names of Mimir. Then she continues, on the hill he stood with Brimir's edge, a sword. His helmet was on his head. Then spake for the first time wise Mimir's head, giving utterance to true words. These were now carved on various objects. The occasion of this incident is unknown. Voluspa tells how, at the approach of the doom of the gods, Odin spoke with Mimir's head, obviously seeking its advice. The poet must thus have known the myth of the cutting off of the head, but forgot what he had already told of Mimir himself. Snorri, who quotes the stanza of Voluspa, gives a different turn to it in his prose narrative. Odin rides to Mimir's well and takes counsel of Mimir himself, not of his head. Mimir's head may at first have been nothing more than the source of the stream of which he was the guardian spirit, or in which he dwelt, the source being the stream's head, or Mimir's head, and the name afterwards taken literally. An explanatory myth was then supplied, as well as stories of the wisdom-giving head, which are not without parallels in Scandinavian custom and belief. In the Eyrbyggja saga, Freystein found a skull lying loose and uncovered on a scree called Geirvor. It sang a stave foretelling bloodshed at the spot and that men's skulls would lie there. This was deemed a great portent. Mimir's connection with Odin is shown by the title given to the letter by the skald Egil Skallagrimsson, Mimir's friend. Mimir's name in its different Eddic forms, Mimir, Mim, Mimi, is connected with words meaning mindful, to brood over, and it seems to have meant the thinking one. Inspiration, knowledge, prophecy were often associated with springs and streams, or with the spirits inhabiting them, and of these Mimir is an example, raised to a high place in Scandinavian myth. The name occurs in place names of rivers, etc., in Germany, Mimling, and Sweden, Mimesa near the Mimesio, as well as in personal names, and bears witness to the widespread belief in a water spirit bearing this name. In the Thidrik saga, Mimir the smith is Siegfried's master in smithcraft, as he is of Velint or Volund in the Vilkina saga, and in both he has supernatural attributes and possesses a wonderful sword. The miming of Saxo's Balder story, called Satyrus Silvarum, has also a magic sword and a magic bracelet which increases its owner's wealth, like the ring Draupnir. The German hero saga Bitterolf speaks of Mimi the Old, a clever mastersmith who made the best swords that the world has ever seen. Saxo's miming, Satyrus Silvarum, might be a dwarf or a wood spirit, and the smiths who bear the name Mimir have elfin traits. Whether they are identical with the Eddic Mimir is uncertain. An elfin or dwarfish wood spirit, clever at smith work and full of wisdom, might also be connected with wells or springs, found often in forests. If they are all identical, we see how, all over the Teutonic area, one out of the host of spirits of the woods and waters rose to preeminence. Mimir as a water spirit was known in late Swedish folklore, haunting the Mimesa. In Snorri's list of giants, Mimir is given as a giant's name, though the notices of him do not suggest a giant personality. But if the son of Bolthorn, who gave Odin 9 mighty songs, was Mimir, then he was at least a giant son. Mimir would then be the brother of Bestla, Odin's mother. Chapter 14. Aegir. Aegir is the god of the sea, or rather a sea giant. In primitive thought, the sea was regarded as a mighty being, which was personified or regarded as more or less distinct from the sea. The kennings for Aegir show that, even in late times, there was not a clear distinction between sea, Aegir, and sea god, Aegir. Snorri says that Say, or sea, is called husband of Ran, visitor of the gods, father of Aegir's daughters, land of Ran. The skald Ref speaks of Aegir's wide jaws, as if the sea itself was a vast being. Into these jaws ran whiles the ships. Aegir, the personal name, or Aegir, sea, is connected with Gothic Ahva, Latin aqua, or water, or river. The name of the river Eidar, or Egidora, or Egisdur, is literally door of the sea. Aegir is also called Gymir in the introduction to Lokasenna and in skaldic verse. Ran, his wife, is Gymir's vulva. The breakers or the murmur of the sea are Gymir's song. The sea is Gymir's dwelling. Aegir's father is Fornjot, a giant who is also father of wind and fire. Though on the whole depicted as a friend of the gods in the Eddas, Aegir is of the giant folk. His name is given in Snorri's list of giants, and Hjumskvita calls him Bergbui and Jotun, and describes him sitting merry as a child, Barnetir, like other giants. Why the sea should be a mountain giant, Bergbui, is not clear. Kindly and good-humoured, Aegir represents the peaceful rather than the stormy sea. The gods feasted in Aegir's halls. Hjumskvita opens by describing a feast at which the gods found the ale scanty. They consulted the divining twigs and the blood, and found that there was abundance in Aegir's dwelling. Thor bade Aegir furnish a banquet for them, but Aegir, in order to cause trouble, said that Thor must procure a vessel large enough to brew ale for all the gods. This is introductory to the story of Thor's adventure with the giant Hymir, to whom he goes to procure this vessel. Lokasenna continues the story. Aegir prepared the banquet in his halls, and to it came many gods and elves. The ale served itself, and the banquet was proceeding gaily, but the gods praised Aegir's servants, Fimafeng and Eldir, for their cleverness, and this annoyed Loki, who slew Fimafeng. The bulk of the poem is taken up with Loki and his slanders of the gods and goddesses. Aegir takes no part in this. Only at the end, ere Loki goes away, does he address Aegir. Ale hast thou brewed, O Aegir, but nevermore wilt thou prepare a banquet. All thy possessions flames shall play over, fire shall burn thy back. That is, the fire which is to consume the world. In explaining why gold is called Aegir's fire, Snorri speaks of this banquet. Aegir had gone to Asgard to a feast, and, on leaving, invited Odin and the Aesir to visit him 3 months hence. When the guests, all but Thor, had assembled, Loki bandied sharp words with the gods and slew Fimafeng. Nothing further is told by Snorri of the banquet, and neither here nor in the story of Thor and Hymir does he speak of the mighty vessel. Lokasenna tells how, in place of fire, bright gold served to give light in Aegir's hall. Snorri enlarges upon this. Aegir caused bright gold to be brought in and set on the floor. It illumined the hall and served as lights at the banquet. Hence gold is called fire, light, or brightness of Aegir, of Ran, or of Aegir's daughters. Gold is also fire of the sea. As Aegir seems to personify the calm sea, the brilliant gleam of the sun on its surface may have given rise to these kennings and to the myth of the light-giving gold in his hall. As brewer of ale for his banquet to the gods, Aegir is called by Egil, ale brewer of all the gods, and as one present at their banquets, he is the visitor of the gods. Aegir also bears the name Hler, and the island Hlesey, or Hler's island, Laeso in the Kattegat, was his dwelling. Snorri begins his Bragareidur with this statement, making Aegir a man versed in magic. He visits the gods in Asgard and partakes of their banquet, and as he sits next to Bragi, he learns many things from him of the doings of the Aesir and of the methods of skaldic art. Hler may have been a local name of the sea giant in Denmark and in the west of Norway. In different accounts, Hler alternates with Aegir as Fionrot's son, who rules the sea. Hilaire may also be the giant Lay who dwells in Laiso according to the Annales Lundenses, or, as in another account, Olaus's Chronica Regum Danorum, a hill giant or troll, with many heads, dwelling within the rocks. Chapter 15. Frigg. The name of Frigg, Odin's consort, or Freya, Lombard Freya, means the beloved, the wife. Odin is the dweller in Frigg's bosom, and Frigg's beloved. Snorri makes her daughter a Fjörgyn, but in Lokasenna, Fjörgyn is her husband, that is, Odin. From them are descended the races of the Aesir. She is called Mother of Balder, co-wife of Jord, Rind, Gunnlod, and Grid, and she is Lady of the Aesir and Asunjur. As foremost of the goddesses and always heading the lists of these, she has the hall Fensalir, sea hall, which is most glorious, but she shares Ylskjaf with Odin. She speaks no prophecy, yet she knows the fates of men. Like Freya, she has hawk's plumage, and is called mistress of the hawk's plumage. Others of the goddesses are associated with Frigg: Fulla, Nja, Hlin, Lofn, either as a servants or hypostasis of herself, creations of the skalds. From what is said of her and of these other goddesses, Frigg may be regarded as a genial, kindly divinity, promoter of marriage and fruitfulness, helper of mankind and dispenser of gifts. She stands beside Freya as one to whom prayers were made. She was invoked by the childless. Example, King Ririr and his queen prayed for offspring to the gods, and Frigg heard them as well as Odin. In her hall Fensalir, Frigg wept bitterly for Valhall's need as a result of Baldur's death, her first grief. She comes prominently into the Baldur myth, and she is grieved because Odin must fall before the Fenris wolf, her second grief. Meyer finds in this reference to Fensalir an explanation of its meaning. As Sigyn weeps for Loki in the forest, where he is punished, so Frigg weeps for Baldur on the seashore by his pyre. Fensalir would thus be the shore, and Frigg's abode was really with Odin in Hlidskjalf. In Vafthrudnismal, when Odin consulted Frigg regarding his journey to the giant Vafthrudnir, she desired him to stay at home rather than go to the strongest of giants. Like others who seek advice, Odin did not follow Frigg's guidance. She then bade him go, journey, and return in safety. May wisdom not fail thee, Aldafadir, when thou comest to speech with the giant. Yet Frigg could at times act cunningly to Odin. In Grimnismal, we see both of them sitting on Hlidskjalf, Frigg thus sharing Odin's oversight of the world. He drew her attention to her foal-stirring Agnar, who begat children with a giantess in a cave, while his brother Geirrod, Odin's fosterling, is a king and rules his land. We have already seen how Frigg announced Odin's coming as a supposed magician to Geirrod's hall, and how he was tortured between two fires. This act of Frigg's corresponds to her craft in winning Odin's help for her favorites in the Lombard story. Some myths told worse things of Frigg. When she begged Loki and Odin at Aegir's feast not to make known what things they did in old days, Loki accused her of misconduct with Odin's brothers, Vili and Ve. This, as we have seen, is amplified in the Jungalinga saga. Corresponding to it is Saxo's story of Myth Othin, the earlier part of which introduces Frigg. Speaking of Odin and his worship, Saxo says that the kings of the north, anxious to worship him more zealously, made a golden image of him and sent it to Byzantium, or Asgard. Its arms were covered with bracelets, and Odin was delighted. But his queen Frigga, desiring to be more adorned, called smiths and had the gold stripped from the image. Odin hanged them and set the image on a pedestal, and by his art caused it to speak when a mortal touched it. In her desire of adornment, Frigga yielded herself to one of her servants, who broke the image and gave her its treasures. In disgust, Odin went into exile, and Myth-Othin took his place. Odin returned only after Frigg was dead. Probably we are to assume that Myth-Othin, like Vili and Ve, took Frigga as wife. The possible meanings of these myths have already been given. Frigg, who gives herself for the sake of personal adornments, resembles Freya, who does the same. Another suggestion of their ultimate identity, or that myths told of one were also told of the other. The opening part of the prose introduction to Grimnismal shows Frigg with Odin in a more pleasing light. They appear as an old peasant and his wife dwelling by the sea. King Raudung had two sons, Agnar and Geirrod, who went fishing in a boat. They were driven out to sea and wrecked on the coast where Odin and Frigg dwelt. With them they spent the winter, not knowing who the peasant and his wife were. Odin nourished Geirrod and taught him out of the treasures of his wisdom. Frigg took Agnar in charge. In spring, Odin gave them a ship, and as he and Frigg accompanied the lads to it, Odin took Geirrod apart and spoke privately to him. The youths had a fair wind and reached their father's place. But as Geirrod sprang ashore, he pushed out the boat with Agnar, saying, "Go where evil spirits may have thee." The vessel was driven out to sea, but Geirrod was well received by the people and made king, for his father was dead. This explains why Odin and Frigg are respectively foster parents of Geirrod and Agnar. The goddess Lin was defender of Frigg's favorites of Austerlings. Nothing is known in detail of the cult of Frigg, nor can it be proved that she was originally an earth goddess, consort of a heaven god, but later assigned to Odin. Her name occurs in that of the sixth day of the week as the equivalent of Dies Veneris, Old Frisian Friggendei, or Fragdgar. The occurrence of these names shows that Frigg was known both to Scandinavians and West Germans, and that she was equated with Venus. The English Ælfric speaks of her as that foul goddess Venus whom men called Frigg. The Lombards knew her as Freya, the Thuringians as Freyja, whose sister was Volla, the Norse Fulla, according to the Merseburg charm. Geoffrey of Monmouth says that, after Woden, the Anglo-Saxons worshipped among others the most powerful goddess, after whose name the sixth day was called Fredae. Reminiscences of Frigg appear in tradition. In Sweden, at the religious observance of Thursday, when the house was prepared for the visit of deities, the expression was used, "Hallow the god Thor and Frigg." On the same day, no spindle or distaff could be used, for Frigg herself then span. In the evening, an old man and woman might be seen sitting at the distaff, that is, Thor and Frigg. Why she was thus associated with Thor is unknown. In Sweden, the stars forming the belt in the constellation Orion are called Frigg's spindle and distaff. Thus she was associated with women's work. In Iceland, an orchis from which love philtres are made is called Frigjargras, and a certain fern is called Freyhuar. Chapter 16. Idun. In his former list of the Asunjur, Snorri does not mention Idun, but elsewhere he includes her among them. She was wife of Bragi and dwelt at Brunkar's brook. As goddess of immortality, she is described by Kaufmann as keeping the venerable father of singers young even in old age, a beautiful symbol of the undying freshness of poetry, and by Gering as indicating the immortality of song. She guarded in her coffer the apples which the gods tasted when they began to grow old. Thus they grew young, and so it continued to the doom of the gods. Gangleri, to whom this was told, said that the gods have entrusted much to Idun's care. Then he was told how once the gods' ruin was nearly wrought, and this is the subject of the myth of Thiazi and Idun. Idun was called Keeper of the Apples, and they are the elixir of the Aesir, hence also her name, from the prefix id, again, and the termination un, common in female names. This gives the meaning renewal. Restoration of youth. Idun is a common woman's name in Iceland. In Lokasenna, Idun besought Bragi at Aegir's banquet not to speak ill of Loki. Loki accused her of hunting after men and of winding her white arms round the neck of a brother's murderer. She replied that she would not speak opprobrious words of Loki, but would soothe Bragi, excited by beer, so that he and Loki would not fight in anger. Nothing else is known of the subjects of Loki's accusation. The myth of Thiazi is told by Snorri and by the poet Theodulf of Hvin, 10th century, in the Haustlong. Odin, Loki, and Hoenir had wandered over wastes and mountains, and found a herd of oxen, one of which they slew and roasted. Twice they scattered the fire and found that the meat was not cooked. Perplexed at this, they heard a voice from a tree saying that he who sat there had caused the fire to give no heat. A great eagle was the speaker, and he said that the ox would be cooked if they gave him a share. To this they agreed, but the eagle, the giant Thiazi in disguise, took a thigh and 2 forequarters of the ox. Loki snatched up a pole and struck him, but as the eagle flew off with the pole sticking in its back, Loki, hanging on to the other end, was carried off and his feet dashed against rocks and trees, while his arms were nearly torn from their sockets. He cried out, but Thiazi would not free him until he promised to induce Idun to come out of Asgard with her apples. He accepted these terms, and in due time lured Idun from Asgard by telling her of apples more wonderful than her own, growing in a wood. When she went there, Thiazi as an eagle carried her off to his abode, Thrumheim. The Aesir soon began to grow old, and consulting together, recalled that Idun had been seen leaving Asgard with Loki. He was now threatened with torture or death, and promised to seek Idun in Jotunheim. Borrowing Freya's bird plumage, he flew off there and found that Thiazi had gone to sea, leaving Idun alone. Loki changed her to a nut and flew off with her, grasped in his claws. Thiazi returned and gave chase, but when the Aesir saw the pursuit, they collected bundles of wood chips and made a fire with them. Thiazi was flying too swiftly to stop. His wings caught fire, and the gods slew him. Of this death of Thiazi, Thor boasts in Harbardsljóð, as if he were the sole slayer. Loki also maintained that he was the first and last at the deadly fight when Thiazi was slain. This myth has been explained in terms of nature phenomena. Idun is the luxuriant green of vegetation, which falls as booty to the giant, the demon of autumn storms, but is brought back by Loki, the warm air, in spring. But if the gods were believed to owe immortal youth to magical apples, then inevitably the Jotuns, their enemies, would seek to gain possession of these. As apples were unknown in Iceland and only known in Norway at a later time, when grown in monastic gardens, the Idun myth has been regarded as one formed by skalds out of biblical conceptions of the fruit of the tree of life, the myth of the garden of the Hesperides, and Irish stories of magic apples. None of these sources, however, quite accounts for the myth, and it is quite likely that there is here a primitive conception, possibly worked upon by outside sources, of the immortal youth or strength of gods being dependent on certain magic foods, like soma, nectar, and ambrosia, or, in Irish myths, Manannán swine, Goibniu's ale, or the apples of the land of youth. Gefjun. Snorri includes Gefjun among the Asyniur. She is a virgin, and on her attend all who die maidens. At Aegir's banquet she tried to stay the strife by saying that Loki is well known as a slanderer and hater of all persons. Loki bids her be silent. He cannot forget him who allured her to lust, the fair youth to whom she surrendered herself for the sake of a necklace. Odin then cried, "Mad thou art and raving, Loki," in rousing Gefjun's wrath, for she knows the destinies of all as well as I. Gefjun was called upon in the taking of oaths. Certain statements in these notices of Gefjun may show that she is like, if not identical, with Frigg and Freya. She is mistress of dead maidens, and maidens, example, Thorgerd, go to Freya after death. Her surrender of herself for the sake of a necklace recalls the Brisinga men myth. Her prophetic knowledge, equal to Odin's, makes her like Frigg, who knows all fates of men. While these common factors may not establish identity, they show that goddesses worshipped in different localities tended to have the same traits, or that similar myths were apt to be told of them. Gefjun's name also resembles one of the names of Freya, that is, Geffen, but more probably the name means giver. The same, or as some think, a different Gefjun, is the subject of a story told by Snorri in the Edda and in his Heimskringla. In the Eddic account, Gylfi, king of Sweden, gave a wandering woman named Gefjun, of the kin of the Aesir, as much land as 4 oxen could plough in a day and a night. This was in return for the pleasure which his skill had given him. She took 4 oxen out of Jotunheim, her sons by a giant, and yoked them to the plough. The land was now cut so deep that it was torn out and drawn by the oxen out to the sea, where it remained in a sound. Gefjun gave it the name Selund, or sea land. The place once occupied by it in Sweden became water, which was now named Log, or Lake Malar. The bays in that lake correspond to headlands in Sealand. Snorri then quotes a verse from the poet Bragi's Shield Lay, describing this act. In the Heimskringla, the story is connected with the wandering of the Aesir over Denmark to South Sweden. Odin sent Gefjun over the Sound to seek land, and there Gylfi gave her the gift. Now she went to Jotunheim, where she bore 4 sons to a giant, and turned them into oxen. Then follows the account of the formation of Sealand. Odin's son Skjold married Gefjun, and they dwelt at Leidra, or Leyre. Here also the Bragi stanza is quoted. This story is cosmogonic. It tells how an island was formed. In the original myth, Sealand could hardly have been regarded as torn out of a part of Sweden at such a distance from it. This geographical inconsistency arose from the fact that Gylfi was regarded as king of Sweden. This piece of euhemerism dates from the 13th century. Gylfi may originally have been a god. Ulrich, comparing the myth with traditional plough rites at New Year surviving in Scandinavia and England, in which the plough is paraded, drawn by men masked as oxen under the lead of a woman, or a man masquerading as a woman, suggests that it was derived from such ritual. The rite was a fertility charm, and Gefjun was a Danish goddess of fertility and agriculture. That Gefjun was a Danish goddess is shown by her connection with Skjold, the eponymous ancestor of the Skjoldings, or Danish kings. Skjold is the god of the Scanians, Skanunga god, and the Scanians were the people of Denmark, or of part of it, the island Skane. Possibly Gefjun is Nerthus, or a form of Nerthus. Her name, if connected with Gefa, to give, or with Gothic Gabay, or riches, would be in keeping with her attributes both as a giver of fertility or as a giver of land to Denmark. The name would then be found again in the Gabii, or Algabii, of Romano-German inscriptions, the givers, or all givers. If the myth is derived from the ritual, it is also linked to stories regarding the origin of islands or of land obtained by various stratagems with the plough or the hide of an ox. The association of an eponymous king, Skjold, with a goddess has a parallel in Yndlol Yod, where Freya is associated with Ottar, connected with the royal house. Gefjun must once have been worshipped in Sealand. Sif. Sif was Thor's wife, and he is often known merely as Sif's husband. She was famous for her golden hair, and was called the fair-haired goddess. The myth told about her hair will be given in chapter 26. Sif poured mead for Loki at Aegir's feast, wishing him hail, and saying that he knew her to be blameless among the deities. To this, Loki replied that he knew one who had possessed her, that is, himself. In Harbard's Ljod, Harbard taunts Thor by saying that Sif has a lover at home, and that he should put forth his strength on him rather than on Harbard. Perhaps this lover was Loki. When Hrungnir came to Asgard in giant fury, he threatened to carry off Sif and Freya. Sif was mother of Thrud by Thor, and of Ul by some other father. Saga. Saga is named by Snorri as the second goddess after Frigg. She dwells at a great abode, Sokvabek, sinking stream, a waterfall, and here, where cool waves wash her abode, Odin and she drink joyfully each day out of golden vessels. Some scholars regard Saga as a mere reflection of Frigg. Her name has no connection with the Icelandic sagas, but means she who sees and knows all things, as Odin does, and her dwelling, a water world, resembles Frigg's Fensalir, also near the waters. As the liquor drunk is presumably a draught of wisdom, and as Saga dwells in or beside a waterfall, she may be a water spirit, a female counterpart of Mimir. With such elfins, no less than in wells and streams, secret knowledge was supposed to reside. Unfortunately, the myth which told of Odin's connection with her is not now extant. In Helga Kvita Hundingsbana, a cape called after her is mentioned, Sagunes. Sol and Bil. Snorri says that Sol and Bil are reckoned among the Asunjur. Sol is the sun, regarded as female, and in another passage, Snorri tells how she and her brother the moon are children of Mundilfari, both of them so fair and comely that he called them Sol and Main. Sol was married to the man Glen. The gods were so angry at Mundilfari's insolence in giving them these names that they set Sol and Main in the sky, making Sol drive the horses that draw the chariot of the sun, while Main steers the course of the moon and determines its waxing and waning. Snorri thus distinguishes between the actual sun and moon and those worshipful beings who direct their courses. In Vafthrudnismal, Mundilfari is spoken of, and his children Sol and Main are said to be journey daily round the heaven to measure time for men. Here they are rather the actual sun and moon. In the Merseburg charm, Sunna, the sun, is named as sister of Saint Gunt. The sex of the sun agrees with popular German folklore regarding it. Snorri also says that Main raised the two children of Vidfinn, or wood dweller, from the earth as they came from the well Burgir. Their names were Bil and Yuki. On their shoulders they were carrying the basket Sægr on the pole Simul. These two follow the moon, as one can see from the earth. As Swedish folklore still speaks of the spots on the moon as two people carrying a basket on a pole, this may be taken as the meaning of the myth. There may be some reference to the man in the moon myth, and even the nursery rhyme of Jack and Jill has been supposed to have a link with Bil and Yuki. Why Bil is called a goddess is unknown, but in Odrunar Gratr, the phrase Linvenges Bil, in the sense of goddess of gold, is used as a kenning for woman. Fulla. Fulla is said to be a maid who has loose tresses and a band of gold about her head. She bears Frigg's coffer and has charge over her footgear, and is acquainted with her secret plans. Hence Frigg is mistress of Fulla. A kenning for gold is the snood of Fulla, with reference to her golden fillet. After his death, Baldur's wife Nanna sent Fulla a golden ring from hell. As has been seen, the introduction to Grimnismal tells how Frigg sent Fulla with a message to Geirrod about Odin. The Merseburg charm tells how Vol, sister of Freya, or Frigg, tried to charm the horse's foot. Vol is Fulla, and she was thus known in Germany and regarded as Frigg's sister. In the Baldur story, she takes rank with Frigg, since they are the only goddesses to whom Nanna sends gifts from hell. The name Fulla means fullness, abundance, and the Dame Habonde or Abundia of medieval folk belief may be a reminiscence of Fulla, who perhaps distributed Frigg's gifts out of her coffer. If Frigg was an earth goddess, Fulla or fullness would be an appropriate companion for her. She is perhaps no more than a form of Frigg. Lofn, Sjofn, Lin, Nja. Other goddesses associated with Frigg are Lofn, Lin, and Nja. Lofn is kind to those who call on her, willingly hears prayer, and is mild. She has the permission of Odin and Frigg to bring together in marriage those to whom it had been forbidden before, or who had found difficulties in the way. From her name, such permission is called Lof. Akin to her, though not mentioned in connection with Frigg, is Sjofn, who is zealous in turning the thoughts of men and women to love. From her name, love is called Sjofni. Lin is said to guard men whom Frigg wishes to preserve from danger. Nja is said by Frigg into different lands on her affairs, and rides the horse which can run through air and sea, called Hofvarpnir, or Hoof Tosser. Snorri, from whom this account of these goddesses is taken, then cites lines from a lost Eddic poem, which recounted a myth of Nja, riding forth on an errand for Frigg. Some of the Vanir once saw her riding through the air, and one of them said, "Who flies there?" Who travels there? Who glides through the air? Nya replied, I do not fly, though I do travel, gliding through the air, on hoofed horse's back, on the swift Gardrofa, begotten by Hamskerpir. Things high in the air are said to raise themselves, Naefa, after Nya's name. Apart from this notice by Snorri, nothing is known of Nya, except that a name is used as a kenning for woman. Some of these goddesses may be merely forms of Frigg herself. In Voluspa, a new grief is said to come to Lin when Odin goes to fight with the Fenris wolf. Lin is here a name of Frigg and means protector. Eir, Var, Sun, Snotra. Other goddesses are named by Snorri. Eir is the best physician. One of the servants of Menglod in Svipdagsmal has the same name, and Menglod has some connection with the healing art. She sat on the hill Lufjaberg, or Hill of Healing, and it will long be a joy to the sick and suffering. Each woman who climbs it, however long she has been sick, will grow well. This is doubtless some reference here to folk custom and to local goddesses of healing. Eir is the one who cares for. Her name is used in the sense of goddess in kennings for woman. Var listens to oaths and complaints made between men and women. Hence, such compacts are called Varar. She takes vengeance on those who break them, and she is wise and desirous of knowledge. Nothing can remain hidden from her. Var is mentioned in Thrumskvita, when Thrym says at his marriage with the superstitious Freya, in the name of Var, consecrate our union. Var has thus to do with the marriage bond, and marriage was one of Frigg's concerns. Sun, denial, guards the doors in the hall and shuts them before those who should not enter. She is appointed as guardian in lawsuits where men would deny something, hence the saying that Sun is present when one denies anything. Snotra, or prudent, is wise and decorous of manner. Hence after her name, prudent persons are called Snotr. Thorgerd, Holgabrud, and Urba. The giantess goddess Skadi may have been of Finnish origin, but she was included among the Asunjur. On the borderland of Finns and Scandinavians, that is, in Halogaland, we find the cult of two sister goddesses, Thorgerd, Holgabrud, and Urba, who were never included among the Asunjur. Snorri says that Thorgerd's father was Holgi, king of Halogaland, which was named after him. Sacrifice was made to both father and daughter. A cairn was raised over Holgi, consisting of a layer of gold and silver, sacrificial money, and a layer of earth and stones. Holgi was the eponymous king of the region said to be named after him. According to Saxo, Helgo, king of Halogaland, was in love with Thora, daughter of Kuso, king of the Finns. Being a stammerer, he induced Hotherus to plead his cause with her, and he was so successful that she became Helge's wife. Saxo's Thora is Thorgerd, who was really Holga's or Helgi's wife, not his daughter, hence Holgabrud, or Holgi's bride. The Jarls of Halogaland seem to have regarded Thorgerd and Urba as their guardians. Nothing is known of Urba's origin. Jarl Akon of Lather, in the later part of the 10th century, was devoted to their cult. In some of the sagas we hear of temples of these goddesses, their images standing on each side of Thor, wearing gold rings. Hakon took Sigmund Bretti's son to a secluded temple in the forest, full of images, among these one of Thorgerd, before which he prostrated himself. He then told Sigmund that he would sacrifice to her, and the sign of a favor would be that her ring would be loose on her finger, and the ring would bring good fortune to Sigmund. At first the goddess seemed to withhold the ring, but when Hakon again prostrated himself, she released it. The Jomsviking saga tells how Hakon sought Thorgerd's and Irpa's help during the naval battle with the Jomsvikings. At first Thorgerd was deaf to his prayers and offerings, but when he sacrificed his son to her, the goddess came to his aid. From the north there came thunder, lightning, and hail, and Thorgerd was seen with Hakon's people by the second-sighted. From each of her fingers seemed to fly an arrow, and each arrow killed a man. This was told to Sigvald, who said that they were not fighting men, but evil trolls. As the storm diminished, Hakon again appealed to the sisters, reminding them of his sacrifice. And now the hail grew worse, and Thorgerd and Irpa were seen with his ships. Sigvald fled, because he could do nothing against such demons. A late saga, that of Thorleif's Jarla Skald, tells how Hakon removed a spear which had belonged to Horgi or Holgi from the temple of the goddesses. He desired to be revenged on Thorleif and asked help from them. A human figure was carved, and by means of their magic and that of the Jarl, the heart of a dead man was inserted in it. By magic also the figure was made to walk and speak. It was dispatched to Iceland, armed with the spear, and Thorleif was slain. In the story of Olaf Tryggvason, the temple was destroyed by him, and Thorgerd's image stripped of his gold and silver adornments and vestments, and afterwards destroyed with that of Frey. In the Njal saga, there is another account of a destruction of the temple. Rapp went into it and saw a life-size image of Thorgerd with a great gold ring on her arm and a wimple on her head. These he took from her, as well as a second ring from the image of Thor in his wagon, and a third from the image of Irpa. Then he dragged the images forth and set fire to the temple. When Hakon found the images stripped of their gear, he knew what had happened, but said that the gods did not always avenge everything on the spot. The man who has done this will no doubt be driven away out of Valhall, and never come in thither. These goddesses were revered as guardians, and their cult was prominent towards the close of the pagan period. They were probably of the class of female supernatural beings called Disir, of whom more will be said later. Their aid was given through magic and through their power over the forces of nature. Whether they were actually Finnish goddesses accepted in parts of Scandinavia, or whether because of their magic they came to be so regarded, is differently answered by different students. In Christian times, an evil reputation attached to Thorgerd, and she was called Thorgerd Holga Troll. There is some connection between Thorgerd, the bride of Holgi, Saxo's Helgi, and Thora, and Helgi and the Valkyrie Svava in Helgakvita Jorvardsonar. In this poem, Helgi is silent and forgets names, just as Saxo's Helgi stammered and was ashamed to be heard speaking. Svava guards Helgi and is betrothed to him. The horses of Svava and her fellows Valkyries drop hail and dew on woods and dales. She and they have power over nature, just as Thorgerd had. In this poem, however, the wooing by another is transferred to Helgi's father Jorvard, and Atli woos Siglin on his behalf. As we shall see, Valkyries were included among the Disir. Chapter 17. Ran. The Skalds had many names for the sea in its different aspects. Its hurtful character was personified in the sea goddess Ran, robbery, though she was rather demoniac than divine. Of terrifying nature, she was yet wife of Aegir, the sea in its calmer mood. The sea was called husband of Ran, land of Ran, Ran's road, and the wave with red stain runs out of white Ran's mouth. Aegir and Ran had 9 daughters whose names show that they are personifications of the waves. Among the riddles which Gestumblindi asked of Heydrich was, "Who are the maidens who go at their father's bidding, white-hooded, with shining locks?" The answer was, the waves of Aegir's daughters. Aegis Meyjar. In Helgaksvrita Hundingsbana, the noise of Kolga's sister, Kolga was one of Aegir's daughters, dashing on Helge's ships is like that of breakers on the rocks, and Aegir's fearful daughters seeks to sink them. But the vessel was wrested from the claws of Ran. In Helga Kveta Jorvard Sonar, Atli says to the monstrous Rimgerd that she had sought to consign the warriors to Ran. In the first of these passages, Ran tries to drag down the ships with her hands. She also possesses a net with which to catch seafarers, and the gods first became aware of this when they were present in Aegir's hall. The skald Ref speaks of Ran's wiling ships into Aegir's wide jaws. Hence to be drowned at the sea was to go to Ran. The drowned were taken by Ran to her domain. She was goddess of the drowned and dangerous to seafarers. Yet not all the drowned went to her halls. When Thorstein and his men perished at sea, they were seen by his shepherd within a hill near their dwellings. In the Eagle saga, Bodvar, Eagle's son, was drowned, and his father cried, "Ran hath vexed me sore. The sea has cut the bonds of my race. I shall take up my cause against the brewer of all the gods, Aegir, and wage war with the awful maids of the breakers, Aegir's daughters, and fight with Aegir's wife." Folk belief held that it was good to have gold in one's possession when drowning. In the Frithjof saga, Frithjof says in the storm that some of his people will fare to Ran, and they should be well adorned and have some gold. He broke a ring and divided it among them, saying, "Before Aegir slays us, gold must be seen on the guests in the midst of Ran's hall." The fate of the drowned was not altogether bad. A piece of folk belief about the drowned is preserved in the Eyrbyggja saga, and it describes how Thorod and his men, drowned at sea, came as ghosts dripping with water to drink the Yule ale several nights in succession. They were welcomed by their relatives, and it was a token that the drowned who thus came to their own burial ale would have good cheer of Ran. This old belief, as the saga says, had not been set aside, though men had been baptized and were Christian in name. In Ran's halls the drowned feasted on lobsters and the like. In later folk belief, Ran was still to be seen reclining on the shore combing her hair, like a mermaid, or in winter drawing near to the fires kindled by fishermen on the shores of the Lofoten Islands. Swedish folk belief also knew Ran as Sjora, or Lady of the Sea. Ran, the cruel and unfeeling, may be regarded as originally a demoniac being of the waters, who tended to be viewed also as a guardian goddess of the drowned, whom, if she slew, she entertained in her water-walled halls. Personification of the waves is found in Celtic mythology, Irish and Welsh. They were the sea god Manannan's horses, or the locks of his wife. They bewailed the locks of Dylan, son of the wave, and sought to avenge him. 9 waves, or the 9th wave, had great importance in folk belief.